This is chapter 3 of Friedrich Pollock, the Éminence Grise of the Frankfurt School, by Philipp Lenhard. The title of the chapter is Failed Revolution. Here we go. Following the London incident, Julius and Elizabeth Pollock wanted nothing more than a return to, what they considered, normality. They wanted Friedrich Pollock to abandon his fantasies and grow into his commitments. The professional routine in the factory would surely knock some sense into him. Within a few months of Friedrich Pollock's return to Stuttgart, something occurred that few had experienced until very recently. On the 1st of August 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, a declaration of war against France followed. With the war, supposedly required to defend Germany's honor, came new priorities. In this hour of need, the economy was expected to serve the nation and subordinate all self-interest to the common weal. Julius Pollock instantly realized that he would be able to combine such ostensibly altruistic commitments with the attainment of healthy profits. Finally, selling his remaining shares of ʻpɔlɔk in Freiburg, Julius Pollock threw all his energy into shifting production in Stuttgart towards products required to support the war effort, notably holsters and ammunition pouches. Given the enormous demand for such products, he was quickly able massively to grow not only the concern's production capacity, but also its profits. Given that Nördlinger and Pollock had thus been turned into an enterprise of strategic significance, Friedrich Pollock, for all his resentment of his father's activities in the family business, was not initially caught up. As not least, Julius Pollock's acquisition in 1916 of a stylish villa in prime location on Lessingstrasse, just 5 minutes by foot from the Horkheimers, indicates he now became a seriously wealthy man. Friedrich Pollock still resented working in the family business where he felt he was wasting his time. Like millions of his peers, though in marked contrast to Horkheimer, Friedrich Pollock believed the official propaganda that presented the conflict as a just war of defense against the tyrannical Tsar. On the 17th of July, as war seemed increasingly likely, Horkheimer, who was staying at a health resort in Villingen, noted that he did not understand, quote, where people are finding their so-called, quote, enthusiasm, end quote. Repulsed by the burgeoning nationalism, Horkheimer wrote, quote, the peoples are avaricious and envious and deceitful. All it takes is a coincidence, some arbitrary incident. Conflict ensues and the whole thing goes off. The German is convinced he is right and screams blue murder. The Frenchman is convinced he is right and screams blue murder. The Russian is convinced he's right and screams blue murder, and on it goes. The Serbian, too, is convinced he is right and screams, like all the others, that he must defend his, quote, national honor, end quote. Which of the squabbling parties really is more evil than the others, I do not know, but I am confident there is little difference between them, since war is always a matter of the, quote, people, and the herd is always equally foolish. What is so outrageous about the current issue is the profligate human delusion that it would be good and just to sacrifice the lives of hundreds of thousands of human beings for 2 lives that have been lost. It demonstrates the foolishness and wantonness of society which, alas, is in evidence in the majority of human actions, and yet one says, quote, needs must, end quote, and consoles oneself with this contention, end quote. Horkheimer. On this issue, then, Horkheimer and Pollock were fundamentally at odds. Pollock inclined more toward the stance of the majority socialists. German social democracy had long considered Tsarist Russia one of the principal obstacles to progress in Europe. That was a position shared by Marx as well, as a side note for me. In 1907, the late social democratic leader August Bebel had called Russia a, quote, bastion of cruelty and barbarism, end quote, suggesting that, quote, this old boy would still be ready to shoulder a rifle and go to war against Russia, end quote. Pollock was was motivated not so much by nationalism, but primarily by the desire to join, in the name of humankind, the fight against the autocratic regime in St. Petersburg. In his fictitious exchange of letters, quote, war, end quote, written at the time, Horkheimer summarized the ideology of the internal truce, parenthesis, Bergfrieden, end parenthesis. All social distinctions had supposedly been transcended, quote, workers and prince, beggar and millionaire, Jew and Christian, end quote, stood united against the external enemy. In his initial enthusiasm, Pollock would seem to have subscribed to this point of view. In the spring of 1915, Pollock was called up but not sent to the front. Instead, Pollock was sent to barracks closer to home than the front, where his enthusiasm soon dissipated. The awful news from the front undermined the official propaganda, and the monotonous routine on the base hardly struck him as healthy. Whenever possible, Pollock ducked orders, quote, partly for genuine organizational reasons, partly due to my bad faith, end quote. Pollock was stationed with a transport logistics unit in Ludwigsburg. Given how close Ludwigsburg was to Stuttgart, Pollock was frequently able to go home. Pollock's leave seems to have been fairly generous, and it is conceivable that Pollock may have bribed his superiors to get additional time off. As Leo Löwenthal later recalled, this is not at all unusual in regiments where, quote, the boys from respectable, well-to-do families served, end quote. Horkheimer's attempts to convince Pollock that the reports issued by the General Staff were fictitious and that the war was pointless gradually made inroads. This made it all the more difficult to rejoin the unit after a night or two spent in Stuttgart. Pollock was far removed from the suffering and death at the front. Of these, Pollock knew only from the heavily censored reports in the press and the accounts of the returnees from the front. The war offered Pollock no, quote, inner experience, end quote, of the kind Ernst Junger romanticized in the war diaries he published in 1920, but neither did he suffer the indignities many of his peers confronted. In Pollock's predominantly proletarian regiment based, in his predominantly proletarian regiment based in Hanau, Leo Löwenthal, for example, was confronted with anti-Semitic, quote, banter, end quote. Löwenthal later likened this time as a soldier to being in a, quote, concentration camp, avant la lettre, end quote. Avant la lettre means before the letter. Pollock was spared this particular Jewish experience of the First World War, often associated symbolically with the military census, specifically targeting Jews, parenthesis, Judenseelung, end parenthesis, of 1916, though it should be noted that the census did not necessarily impact Jewish soldiers at the front in the same way as their brethren back home. Pollock neither recorded any anti-Semitic insults nor seems to have been concerned by the census. Pollock was, above all, bored and frustrated and yearning for a very different, quote, state of emergency, end quote. The Île Heureuse, which is, what was that Happy Island that we looked at before? Happy Island. Even so, the summer of 1915 did bring an exciting new encounter in the form of a date with a Frenchwoman 4 years his junior, André Woog, parenthesis, 1898 to 1939, and parenthesis, known as Day. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Let's see what Wikipedia says. Google Translate says. D, I guess. Known as D. With whom Pollock subsequently began to go out. Originally from Paris, Day had moved to Stuttgart some years before when her mother, Adrienne Salomon, parenthesis, 1876 to 1928, end parenthesis, remarried following the untimely death of her first husband, Raoul Woog, parenthesis, 1868 to 1899, in parentheses. Andri's stepfather, Sigmund Kahn, parentheses, 1872 to 1953, end parentheses, who, in Pollock's account, could be, quote, narrow-minded and petty, end quote, as a well-to-do, respectable member of the city's haute bourgeoisie, and thus acquainted with the Horkheimer family. Adrian Kahn Voog, it's probably actually Voog, it's W-O-O-G, I've never seen that name in my life. Adrian Kahn Voog was hell-bent on marrying her daughter to Max Horkheimer, whom she considered an eminently eligible and highly desirable bachelor. Horkheimer's mother, Babette, determined to see her son married, quote, at least a Jewish princess, end quote, thought little of the idea. Nor was Max Horkheimer inclined to go on a date with her, since he had recently fallen for his father's private secretary, Rose, quote, Maidon, end quote, Reicher, parenthesis, 1888 to 1969, end parenthesis, his future wife. Horkheimer and Andri were childhood friends, and he was only too happy to see his best friend, who had been interested in her for some time, take his place at the prearranged date. The young woman was stunned when Pollock turned up instead of Horkheimer and told her point blank, quote, look, Andre, here's the thing. ... The thing with Max is an error. He likes you a lot, but he's got a girlfriend whom he is going to marry one day. But I care a lot for you too, so let's discuss the possibility of our going out, end quote. The matter-of-fact and entirely unromantic language Pollock deployed on this occasion, parenthesis, at least according to his own recollection, end parenthesis, is reminiscent of that of his friendship contract with Horkheimer. It was now up to Voog to make a decision in his favor. This is a far cry from the enraptured infatuation that had characterized Horkheimer's numerous flings. Voog had not swept Pollock off his feet. He, quote, cared for her, end quote, and therefore proposed that she be his girlfriend. She agreed and spent the rest of the day at home with him, parenthesis, his parents happened to be away, end parenthesis. As Horkheimer had done with Neumeier, Pollock, assuming that he took what he took to be his duty as an urbane gentleman, now took it upon himself to, quote, educate, end quote, his girlfriend. Pollock informed her about the meaninglessness of life and laid out the tenets of his and Horkheimer's, quote, religion, end quote. The deep connection that developed between Pollock and Voog in subsequent years hinged in no small measure on her willingness to acknowledge the significance of his special bond with Horkheimer. Nothing in the preserved papers suggests that she was in any way dissatisfied with the role she played in Pollock's life relative to Horkheimer. Pollock's feelings for Voog were real enough, but he maintained a clear distinction between this particular kind of love and the attachment on which his covenant with Horkheimer rested. In 1917, as his still vague political interest gradually intensified, Pollock suggested to Voog that she would be better off with a different partner. Determined to become a politician after the war, Pollock could not afford to be, quote, weighed down by a wife, end quote. He later recalled, least of all, quote, if she is as apolitical as Andri, end quote. Clearly, Pollock's feelings for Voog were at odds with his rational, entrepreneurial, and foresighted outlook. Pollock was part single-minded businessman, part rebel on a quest for the good life. The contradictions between these two dimensions of his personality sometimes led him to behave in extraordinary ways. His perfectly serious suggestion that Voog, who worked as an auxiliary nurse during the war, should marry the Jewish lieutenant Julius Marx, parenthesis, 1888 to 1970, end parenthesis, is a case in point. On his account, he told her that, quote, you need to get out of your step-parents' home, away from your domineering mother, or you'll perish, so marry, end quote. In tears, she vowed to marry Marx, yet for the time being, Marx was still at the front, and Voog and Pollock continued to go out and conduct themselves like a couple. At the end of August 1918, with the end of the war in sight, Pollock was able to spend a weekend in Stuttgart again. Although Pollock and Voog had not seen each other for 3 weeks, and one might have thought they would have better things to do than go out, they spent one of the evenings attending a performance of Johann Strauss's operetta, The Bat. The bat is another term they use for deflator mouse. Deflator mouse, or the bat, sometimes called The Revenge of the Bat, is an operetta composed by Johann Strauss II to a German libretto by Karl Hofner and Richard Genet, which premiered in 1874. Back to the text. The war dragged on, although everybody knew it could no longer be won. Horkheimer was called up in 1917, but Horkheimer was soon deemed unfit for service and referred to a clinic in Munich. Pollock, therefore, had little opportunity to discuss the epoch-making caesura of the October Revolution with him. The Bolsheviki had, quote, ended the war, stand for freedom and bread, and no longer wanted to conform, end quote. Horkheimer noted with initial enthusiasm, yet he was soon troubled by the fact that, quote, Lenin had the entire royal family killed, end quote. He considered the execution of an entire family barbaric and felt that it compromised the communist promise of a, quote, more humane society, end quote. Pollock, by contrast, defended the measure, pointing to the risk of the whites reconquering Petersburg and then restoring the monarchy. This disagreement notwithstanding, they were initially united in broadly welcoming the communist experiment. Having spent 3 weeks together in Munich in September 1918, the two friends next met in November. Before leaving them for Munich, Pollock met with Vug to say farewell to her. Utterly distraught, she confessed that she had accepted Marx's proposal and acknowledged that this was the sensible thing to do, but she simply could not marry the man since it was Pollock she loved. She had become ill, suffered from a fever, and was dreadfully lovesick. Pollock consoled her, but remained firm and convinced her to go ahead with the marriage. On the 8th of November 1918, Pollock went to his superior, Ernst Ritter von Brunner, pointed out that the war had been lost no matter what, and asked for leave. Rather remarkably, his request was granted, and Pollock immediately made his way to Munich. There, the two friends were caught up in the convulsions of the November Revolution. They witnessed the storming of public buildings by revolutionary forces and were eager observers as the Free State of Bavaria, proclaimed by Kurt Eisner, took shape. On the morning of the 8th of November 1918, the entire first page of the Münchner Neueste Nachrichten was taken up with a declaration announcing the revolution. Quote, to the population of Munich, the awful fate that has befallen the German people has set Munich's workers and soldiers in motion. A provisional workers, soldiers, and peasants' council took up its work in the premises of the state parliament in the night of the 7th/8th of November. Henceforth, Bavaria is a free state. End quote. The, quote, democratic and social republic, end quote, vowed to secure as bearable a peace settlement for Germany as possible, but also addressed social issues. Quote, the old tension between town and country will disappear. The exchange of foodstuffs will be organized in a rational manner. End quote. Pollock and Horkheimer were seriously impressed. Overnight, the passive and enslaved workers had become political subjects. As yet, they had no idea what their role in the new society might be, but Pollock and Horkheimer watched the political developments with glowing interest. They moved into a shared flat at Von der Tannstrasse 22, close to the university. First, they completed the Abitur, the school finishing qualification required for university admission that their parents had deemed unnecessary, given that they were destined to run their respective family businesses. Given the havoc the war had wreaked on the education of many young men, the qualification was offered in a pared-down version. Alongside their studies for the Abitur, the two friends immersed themselves in the city's vibrant and restive cultural life. Various artists and scholars, authors and philosophers, anarchists and esoterics congregated in cafes and pubs in the Schwabing district. An extraordinary historical moment had turned Munich into a European metropolis of culture that attracted writers and intellectuals from the four corners of the earth. They socialized with artists and acquired innovative works of art, including a well-known watercolor by Franz Marc. They were in friendly terms with Marx's widow, Maria. Wikipedia says Franz Marc lived from 1880 to 1916 and was a German painter and printmaker, one of the key figures of German Expressionism. Franz Marc was a founding member of Der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider, a journal whose name later became synonymous with the circle of artists collaborating in it. Franz Marc's mature works mostly are animals and are known for bright colors. Franz Marc was drafted to serve in the German army at the beginning of World War I and died 2 years later at the Battle of Verdun. In the 1930s, the Nazis named him a degenerate artist as part of their suppression of modern art. However, most of Franz Marc's work survived World War II, securing his legacy. Franz Marc's work is now exhibited in many eminent galleries and museums. Franz Marc's major paintings have attracted large sums, with a record of 42 million pounds for Die Füchse, parenthesis, the foxes, and parenthesis, in 2022. Back to the text. As the case of the photographer Germain Krul illustrates, the line between the city's cultural and political scenes was fluid. Wikipedia says Germaine Louisa Krul lived from 1897 to 1985. Germaine Krul was a photographer, political activist, and hotel owner. Germaine Krul's nationality has been categorized as German, French, and Dutch, but Germaine Krul spent years in Brazil, Republic of the Congo, Thailand, and India. Described as, quote, an especially outspoken example, end quote, of a group of early 20th century female photographers who, quote, could lead lives free from convention, end quote. Germaine Krul is best known for photographically illustrated books, such as her 1928 portfolio, Metal. These photos actually are super sick. I don't know anything about photography, but looks cool to me. Germaine Krul was one of Pollock's most important contacts in Munich. In Germaine Krul's memoirs, Germaine Krul wrote that Pollock had become her lifelong, quote, big brother, end quote. Pollock, conversely, considered himself, quote, a kind of father figure, end quote. Pollock and Horkheimer likely met Germaine Krul in the house of the psychiatrist and communist sympathizer, Dr. Wilhelm Meyer, in Schwabing's Georgenstrasse. One second. Its bourgeois appearance notwithstanding, communists regularly gathered in Meyer's residence, where Germaine Krul, Pollock, and Horkheimer were frequent guests. It was, however, Katja Walch-Lux who formally introduced them. Walch-Lux, who later converted to Judaism in protest against the ever more pervasive anti-Semitism, was a dance teacher whom Horkheimer bumped into by chance in a Schwabing bookstore, close to the radical author and at one point chair of the Bavarian Independent Socialists, parenthesis USPD, end parenthesis, Ernst Toller. She was, at the time, Germaine Krull's best friend. Wikipedia says Ernst Toller lived from 1893 to 1939 and was a German author, playwright, left-wing politician, and revolutionary, known for his expressionist plays. Ernst Toller served in 1919 for 6 days as the president of the short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic, after which Ernst Toller became the head of its army. Ernst Toller was imprisoned for 5 years for his part in the armed resistance by the Bavarian Soviet Republic to the central government in Berlin. While in prison, Ernst Toller wrote several plays that gained him international renown. They were performed in London and New York City as well as in Berlin. In 1933, Ernst Toller was exiled from Germany after the Nazis came to power. Ernst Toller did a lecture tour in 1936 to 37 in the United States and Canada, settling in California for a while before going to New York. He joined other exiles there. He died by suicide in 1939. Back to the text. In 1917, Germaine Krull established a studio on Schellingstrasse where she produced portraits not only of Friedrich Pollock, but also of luminaries such as Thomas Mann, Kurt Eisner, and Ricarda Huch. I already know who those other people are, so I'm not going to look them up. But I don't know who Ricarda Huch is. Ricarda Huch lived from 1864 to 1947 and was a pioneering German intellectual, trained as a historian and author of many works of European history. Ricarda Huch also wrote novels, poems, and a play. Asteroid 879 Ricarda is named in her honor. Back to the text. In addition to being a great artist in the 1930s, Benjamin placed her on par with August Sonder. Germaine Krull was an eminently political individual, deeply immersed in the activities of the radical left. August Sonder lived from 1876 to 1964, was a German portrait and documentary photographer. Sonder's first book, Face of Our Time, was published in 1929. Sonder has been described as, quote, the most important German portrait photographer of the early 20th century. August Sonder's work includes landscape, nature, architecture, and street photography. But August Sonder is best known for his portraits, as exemplified by his series, People of the 20th Century. In this series, he aims to show a cross-section of society during the Weimar Republic. Back to the text. Lovingly called Soto by her friends, Germaine Krull had seen some tough times. Germaine Krull's father left the family when she was 15. Germaine Krull's strict mother, who ran a guest house in Munich, showed her little love. When Germaine Krull fell pregnant at 18, her mother forced her to have an abortion. Germaine Krull's plan to leave home by going to university was thwarted by the fact that she lacked the requisite qualification for university admission. Hence, Germaine Krull applied to Munich's Teaching and Experimental Institute for Photography, where Germaine Krull's instructors were impressed by her extraordinary talent and enthusiasm for photography. With the support of her friends, Germaine Krull was eventually able to open her own studio. Not short on ambition, Germaine Krull wanted to be, quote, the queen, end quote, and make her studio, quote, the meeting place of all of Schwabing, end quote. And various artists, writers, and politicians did indeed come. Here Germaine Krull's friends, quote, Fritz and Max, end quote, met Elsa Eisner, the wife of the Bavarian Prime Minister Kurt Eisner, communists such as Jakob Heck, and, according to Krull's recollection, the authors Stefan Zweig and Rainer Maria Rilke. Stefan Zweig was an Austrian writer. At the height of his literary career in the 1920s and 1930s, Stefan Zweig was one of the most widely translated and popular writers in the world. Stefan Zweig was raised in Vienna, Austria-Hungary. Zweig wrote historical studies of famous literary figures such as Honoré de Balzac, Charles Dickens, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Dry Meister, parenthesis, 1923 masters, in parenthesis, and decisive historical events in Decisive Moments in History, published in 1927. Zweig wrote biographies of Joseph Fauché in 1929, Mary Stuart, 1935, and Marie Antoinette, Portrait of an Average Woman, 1932, among others. Zweig's best-known fiction includes Letters from an Unknown Woman, published in 1922, Amok, 1922, Fear, 1925, Confusion of Feelings, 1927, 24 Hours in the Life of a Woman, 1927, the psychological novel Beware of Pity, and The Royal Game, 1941. In 1934, as a result of the Nazi Party's rise in Germany and the establishment of the Standesstaat regime in Austria, Zweig emigrated to England and then, in 1940, moved briefly to New York and then to Brazil, where he settled. In his final years, Stefan Zweig would declare himself in love with the country, writing about it in the book Brazil, Land of the Future. Nonetheless, as the years passed, Zweig became increasingly disillusioned and despairing of the future of Europe, and he and his wife Lotta were found dead of a barbiturate overdose in their house in Petropolis on the 23rd of February 1942. They had died the previous day. Stefan Zweig's work has been the basis for several film adaptations. Zweig's memoir, Die Welt von Gestern, The World of Yesterday, published in 1942, is noted for its description of life during the waning years of the Austro-Hungarian Empire under Franz Joseph I, and has been called the most famous book on the Habsburg Empire. Back to the text. Pollock later claimed that he and Horkheimer considered the subsequent Soviet Republic a, quote, calamity, end quote, from the outset. According to Germaine Krull's memoirs, Pollock in particular argued that the time was not yet ripe for a communist revolution. This is a prevalent social democratic viewpoint in line with Karl Kautsky's critique of the October Revolution. Pollock had called the proclamation of the Soviet Republic, quote, totally idiotic, end quote, and wanted Toller to be, quote, arrested immediately, end quote. Friedrich Pollock saw that the communists lacked the support not only of the population at large, but of the workers too, and therefore feared a bloodbath. Quote, we attended all kinds of gatherings. I still remember how one speaker, his name was Unterleitner, said in one of the large assemblies that if the government should send the Prussians, Bavaria would rise up united. They formed their own Freikorps, end quote. One second. Where am I? On balance, Pollock and Horkheimer nevertheless sided with the Republic and accused the Social Democratic government that had retreated to Bamberg of lying. Quote, don't believe the lies about Munich, end quote, Horkheimer wrote to Maidan Richer on the 19th of April 1919, just 12 days after the proclamation of the Soviet Republic. Quote, the liars want to engage in murder for money's sake. We are not in the grip of madness and injustice, end quote. While the two friends played no role in the short-lived Soviet Republic, they did feel an urgent desire to, quote, salvage what might be salvaged, end quote, once it had been quashed. This was the wellspring of their first foray into something resembling active political engagement. In May 1919, at the request of the Social Democratic Bavarian Prime Minister Johannes Hoffmann, whom the communists had chased out of Munich, the Social Democratic German Defense Minister Gustav Noske sent 30,000 regular and irregular Reichswehr soldiers, including the far-right Freikorps, led by Franz von Epp and Ernst Röhm, the subsequent head of the SA, to occupy Munich. Some of Pollock's newfound friends and acquaintances now had to fear for their lives, quote, and now a, quote, white terror, end quote, ensued such as no German city, not even Berlin in March, had yet experienced. For a whole week, the conquerors were at liberty to shoot and everyone, quote, suspected of Spartacism, end quote. In effect, Munich's entire working class population was fair game, end quote. More than 600 actual or alleged communists were literally hunted down and murdered in the streets. Thousands were arrested and tortured. Quote, the white troops marched into Munich, end quote, Germain Krull later recalled. Quote, from the window of Max and Fritz's flat, we saw the red flags burning. Then they were replaced by the blue and white Bavarian flag. They were patrolling the streets. Everywhere there were arrested workers with their hands tied behind their heads. The whites were determined to find the ringleaders responsible for Toller's folly at any price. Having failed to detect one, they decided to go district by district, beginning with the working class quarters. None of the leaders were found. A sense of fear and torment prevailed. I stayed with Max and Fritz since they lived in a distinctly bourgeois area, where it was less dangerous than it would have been in my studio in Schwabing. Traveling by train to Garmisch, Max Horkheimer found himself in the Whites' crosshairs when Freikorps fighters assumed he was Ernst Toller and arrested him. Given Toller's prominent role in the Soviet Republic, a reward of 10,000 Reichsmark had been offered for Toller's arrest. Following the brutal execution of Gustav Landauer, the Whites were frequently searching for Toller in order to make an example of him too. Horkheimer was able to convince his captors that he was not Toller, and they sent him back to Munich where, on arrival, he was detained and accused of being Toller yet again. Quote, we arrived in the evening, end quote, Horkheimer later recalled, quote, where I was taken to a military arrest facility in the station where the officer explained that these two Freikorps, end bracket, hussars would take me somewhere in town. Night had fallen in the meantime, and now I was afraid. I did not want to be, quote, shot while trying to abscond, end quote, as the saying went, end quote. Fortunately, this did not happen, but the experience certainly put the fear of God in Horkheimer. Pollock and Horkheimer witnessed at close quarters of what the soldiers and paramilitary forces, some of whom were already strutting around with swastikas on their helmets, were capable. Soon after Horkheimer's close shave with the Freikorps, one of their acquaintances was killed during a shootout on Odeon Square. They also offered a fugitive they knew, Elia Pupko, refuge in their flat for a night, claiming that he was Pollock's brother, although, quote, he barely spoke German and had a thick Eastern accent, end quote. Pupko, who originally came from the Russian city of Lida, now in Belarus, and read philosophy in Munich, was a close associate of the head of the Soviet Republic, Eugen Levine, it's a Levine with an accent on the final E, who was executed on the 5th of June, 1919. It says Eugene Levine, or Eugen Levine, also known as Dr. Eugen Levine, was a German communist revolutionary and one of the leaders of the short-lived Second Bavarian Soviet Republic. Back to the text. Communist circles began to take note of Pollock as someone with a talent for clandestine transactions who, quote, always knows all the political gossip, end quote, but of whom, alas, one was never quite certain, quote, on which side he stood, end quote. Pollock and Horkheimer also supported Tobias Axelrod, the former Bundist and now director of the Bolshevik Russian government's press operations in Germany, who served as deputy finance commissioner in the Bavarian Soviet government, hiding him in their flat for several days. When the situation became increasingly critical, Germain Krul asked Pollock to let Axelrod use his papers to flee the country. Germain Krul and Axelrod, along with Willy Budek, who had also been a member of the Soviet executive in Munich, (he went on to serve as a high-ranking KPD official), left Munich in the dead of night, intending to cross the Tyrolean Alps into Austria. On the evening of the 10th of May 1919, they reached Eben am Achensee, where they took rooms in the Pletz Aham Inn. Yet, eavesdropping on their guests, the landlady heard them talk about Munich. In addition, they had conversed partly in Russian, which made her all the more suspicious. Quote, she therefore informed the gendarmerie post in Partizau of her suspicions, whereupon the gendarmes brought the two suspects to the station. The lady had supposedly traveled to Innsbruck to acquire a change of clothes. One of the gentlemen called himself Friedrich Pollock, with a CH, claiming to be a businessman from Munich and in charge. He had on him a residential registration issued by the municipal authorities in Munich, saying that he was born in Freiburg, Baden, on the 22nd of May, 1894. He was carrying 2,000 marks and 25 crowns. Since the authenticity of the document was in question, and they had none of the entry documents currently required, it was decided in accordance with the directives issued by the district authorities in Schwaz, to send them back across the border, end quote. One can imagine the refugees' panic at this point, given that Axelrod and Budek were charged with treason and likely faced the death penalty should they be forced to return to Bavaria. With little to lose, they decided that attack was likely the best form of defense. Quote, when they were informed about this decision, Pollock claimed that he was a foreign agent and had information of great importance to the Austrian state. He would divulge the information only to an Austrian government official, however, and demanded to meet one. End quote. While the request was denied, the detainees were given permission to send several telegrams requesting a diplomatic intervention. One of them went to the Austrian foreign minister, the Austro-Marxist Otto Bauer, another to the Hungarian embassy in Vienna, explicitly asking for a radiogram to be sent to Moscow. Admitting that the documents had been provided were false, Axelrod signed this latter telegram with his actual name. Eventually, the three detainees really were deported and taken to Munich. Axelrod was court-martialed and sentenced to 15 years penitentiary. Horkheimer and Pollock followed his case closely. They turned to various associates, including commercial contacts, to mobilize support. Eventually, the Russian government intervened on behalf of its, quote, diplomat, end quote, and Axelrod was able to return to Petrograd, where he took up the work for the Communist International. Germaine Krul and her fiancé, the Ukrainian communist Samuel, quote, Mila, and, quote, Levitt, soon joined him. His direct involvement in Axelrod's abortive attempt to escape notwithstanding, there is nothing in the relevant police files to suggest that Pollock was ever questioned about this episode. Perhaps like many who tried to help those who needed to flee at the time, he had simply reported his passport stolen. This unrelenting succession of dramatic events forced the two friends to abandon what remained of their inward-looking adolescent mindset. Their support for the persecuted revolutionaries was motivated by a newfound political consciousness born of the upheaval in Munich. To be sure, they had previously adopted Schopenhauer's normative conception of compassion and were enthralled to the principle of human solidarity, but only now did society come into focus as a category worthy of examination in its own right. Their turn to the social sciences in the widest sense of the word followed directly from their novel experience in Munich. As Horkheimer later recalled, they had, quote, come to know the Bohemian scene in Schwabing, and eventually I thought, well, would it not be a good idea to go to university? Humankind is an odd sort of community after all, and I ought to know more about it and the world at large, end quote. Horkheimer. In the summer semester, they enrolled at the University of Munich, Pollock, to study what would today be called political studies, parenthesis, Staatswissenschaft, literally science of the state, end parenthesis, and Horkheimer to read philosophy. Pollock's urging notwithstanding, Horkheimer was not overly conscientious when it came to attending lectures and seminars, and Pollock was by far the more diligent student. Pollock took a broad range of courses from economics, politics, and history to philosophy and sociology. Pollock listened attentively as the great sociologist Max Weber, whose sociology remained a lifelong point of reference for Pollock, lectured on, quote, the basic concepts of social knowledge, end quote. Walter Lotz, a liberal economist interested in social questions, introduced him to another topic he would come back to time and again, quote, the theory of money and the currency question, banking, stock exchanges, trade, and exchange policies, end quote. The statistics lectures by Georg von Meyer, an ultra-conservative economist who was the university's vice-chancellor at the time, while altogether less inspiring, later stood Pollock in good stead, not least when it came to the empirical studies undertaken by the Institute of Social Research. Pollock also attended a seminar on the history of the newspaper offered by Sebastian Hausmann, a professorial teaching fellow in political studies who focused principally on historical topics. He accompanied Horkheimer to the survey lecture course on modern, quote, modern philosophy, end quote, offered by Clemens Baumker, who was essentially a medievalist, and in 1916 had published a widely acclaimed monograph on Roger Bacon. Horkheimer, in turn, joined his friend on a survey course on the political foundations of the state by Karl Rothenbucher, a liberal Catholic and expert on state and canon law. Finally, Pollock also attended Konrad Kosak's lecture course on the, quote, socialization of civil law as a result of the revolution, end quote. It is tempting to interpret this diversity of subjects as a precursor of critical theory's emphatic cross-disciplinarity, but it may also reflect no more than a yearning for intellectual orientation. It is important to note that Pollock's budding interest in social theory was not limited to the academic sphere. He was an avid reader of Franz Pfeffert's expressionist libertarian cultural journal, Action, and especially of Die Action, and especially of Die Rote Fahne, parenthesis, the red flag, in parenthesis. Pollock's appetite for Marxist theory had been whet, yet he soon found the communist propaganda he encountered too superficial and simplistic. Consequently, Pollock turned to the original sources, Marx's Capital, Engels' Anti-Düring, and Lenin's State and Revolution. Horkheimer initially took a more skeptical approach, but in August 1919, in light of Pollock's sustained preoccupation with Marxism, they read Nikolai Bukharin's Program of the World Revolution together, and it greatly impressed Horkheimer. Quote, rather than fight for, quote, democracy, end quote, Bukharin clarified in his preface to the Hungarian edition, parenthesis, which was included in translation in the German version, end parenthesis, quote, we proclaim the class dictatorship of the proletariat. Rather than engage in a piecemeal reform, we turn the entire capitalist economic order on its head, end quote. This would ultimately lead to the, quote, abolition of the money system, end quote. Quote, society is being transformed into one huge labor organization or company to produce and distribute what is already produced without the agency of gold coinage or paper money. The end of the power of money is imminent, end quote. Bukharin. Pollock and Horkheimer were enthralled with the radicality of Bukharin's demands, that a world in which the imperialist powers could wage wars that cost millions their lives, in which the proletarian masses were enslaved by wage labor and the accumulation of capital, trumped all other concerns, needed to be comprehensively transformed, instantly resonated with them, For them, the massacres in Munich were a palpable reflection of the class struggle, and they were only too familiar, of course, with the hardship faced by the working class. They had long detested their parents' single-minded preoccupation with the extraction of profit, but were now recognized that it was an expression not of materialism per se, but of bourgeois class interest. Passages such as the following must have taken the words right out of their mouths. Quote, "The rich classes who, even now, have an abundance of money can live at their ease. In towns, traders, merchants, capitalists, and speculators in the country, the quote, kulaks, end quote, parenthesis, rich peasants, end parenthesis, the sharks and sweaters who have fattened on the war to an incredible degree, having saved hundreds of thousands of rubles. Things have reached such a pitch that some buried their money in the ground in boxes or glass jars," end quote. Pollock's father, too, owed his wealth to the war. Now that Marxism had opened his eyes, Pollock despised his father even more than before. For all his faith in the utopian project of his friendship with Horkheimer as a foreshadowing of the good life, Pollock sensed that they could not proceed in isolation from society. The world was in urgent need of change, and as the failed revolution had just shown, one first needed really to understand it to bring about that change. Horkheimer and Pollock therefore decided to move to the calmer city of Frankfurt, where it would be easier to concentrate on their studies. It's the end of chapter 3. Thank you for listening.